Welcome, everybody, to Learn Biz. This is the podcast that is all about small business, and we actually have an exciting guest with us today. This is Camille Pendleton. So Camille is actually a pretty good friend of mine. We have worked together, oh my goodness, this goes back maybe a decade. Through the Small Business Development Center. She is actually the regional director in Orem, Utah, and has held that position for several years now. That's where we first connected. But prior to that, she actually completed her MBA from Utah State University, and then was a consultant with the Connecticut-based Avraham Goldratt Institute. And it was there that she really got into working with the theory of constraints to create improvement. And she took this training and this education and later became the vice president of manufacturing at Bal Seal Engineering, which is in California, where she was able to guide the fulfillment end of the company's growth to over 25 million. So kind of an impressive resume, an impressive background. But before we get too far into this interview, I think there are probably some people out there who maybe have heard the buzz term theory of constraints, but aren't too familiar with it. And since that's your expertise and that's going to be a lot of what we're going to talk about, do you mind giving just the elevator pitch of theory of constraints? We'll get into it, so you'll have plenty of time to really get into some of the juicy details here.
Okay.
But give me the elevator pitch of theory of constraints, and then kind of how did you get into this? Like what inspired you to make this your passion, your expertise in your career?
Okay. Well, great. Thanks, Ryan. I'm super excited to be here. And it's fun to work with you again. So theory of constraints, and the elevator pitch would be, it's the way to focus a complex system so that you can manage it at a pivot point and increase the capacity and make better decisions and just really improve whatever system you're doing, whatever the throughput is. It helps you make it more.
Mm-hmm. I know I'm cheating already because I do want to hear your journey, but I do want to just throw a quick thing out there. Theory of constraint oftentimes hits manufacturing. Do you expand that beyond manufacturing? Service-based businesses that do nothing, that has nothing to do with manufacturing, or other type industries. What's your take there, real quick?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We start with manufacturing because it's so tangible. It's so clear to see how it works. And then you can take the theory, you can take the systems approach to a little more ethereal. Like it's not as easy to see what's happening on, at the company level, or maybe at a distribution chain level, or like a doctor's office, for example. Like what is the system of dependent events that are going on, and where is that constraint, that pivot point? So yeah, it's actually, you can sometimes get more results from a more people-centric, more service-based system, because it is so much harder to kind of see the flow.
Okay. Well, we're going to dive into that, but I got to give you a chance to kind of more fully introduce yourself. I briefly gave a quick bio of some of your expertise, but let's get your background and kind of what led you to chase this expertise in theory of constraints, among other things. I guess I do want to clarify that you've been working with businesses for a couple decades now, multiple businesses. You're probably in the dozens, if not hundreds at this point. So there's obviously a lot more there than just theory of constraints. So anyway, please introduce yourself in a little bit more detail and where your background led you to where you are today.
Okay, thanks. I'd love to. So I have an undergraduate degree in basically educational documentaries. I love them. I love some of the folks like James Burke, who's like mind-blowing back in the day, right? A Connection series. And so I just loved being able to do that sort of work. But I wanted to find something where that kind of background would be helpful to people, and it really improved people's lives. So I went and did a master's in business administration, and my job was to put together an international business seminar, and and then I helped some of the other people do seminars. And so one of them was an accounting seminar that happened up at Utah State University, and a throughput accountant, like the classic Deborah, throughput accountant, came through, and she told me about the theory of constraints, and I was like, what is this thing? I read the goal, and I was like, oh my goodness, talk about a way to take a complex system and just like bring it right down to something that's really manageable, that you can really understand what's going on. And so I applied to the Goldratt Institute. They had an academy at the time where they were taking in, younger folks. And for 6 months, we just went through all the theory of constraints. And then the partner of the firm who sponsored us, we would go and work for them. Mm-hmm. So I worked for Dale Huel for 3 years, just being like, doing all the stuff that the junior folks do. And so I was in on trainings and implementations, and I got to partner with some of the other advisors, and just really saw a variety of the application of theory of constraints. One of the cool ones was this is late 90s, and so the internet's like coming in and disrupting everything. So we got to go I got to go help out with an implementation in the thinking processes on how a financial services company could shift what they do and be ahead of the game and take some market share. And so we went over to London for like 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And worked with that company. Yeah, It was kind of awesome. Yeah. But I did my own implementation with a printing company up in the Northeast, helping them just really accelerate their production. And it was just really fun. But consulting got a little bit old, honestly, because I had a young family, and you come home from traveling and you're tired and you feel like you have nothing to give. So I looked around and found a place where I could be an embedded TOC person. And that was out of California in this really awesome engineering to manufacturing company. Mm-hmm. Super cool. Lots of patents, lots of cool stuff. And they had implemented the theory of constraints on their manufacturing floor. They had gone from 6 to 8 weeks lead time to 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I went in there as project liaison and was helping them move it through sales, customer service, like tying the whole company together so that they could make that all happen. And so, so in my role now, with the Small Business Development Center, I love it because I bring this eclectic set of talents and experience, and I'll see probably 500 businesses in a year.
Okay.
Or business owners, right? And they'll sit down with a variety. I mean, Ryan, you see every industry at every stage. You're like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing. And I get to hear where they are, what they're trying to put together, and just use my background to go, okay, where is the place where we can focus our efforts for the least amount of effort to get the biggest amount of return? And so that's what I do every day, and it's crazy fun.
So as you were talking about, you're like, probably one of the ones that caught me off guard is I was doing a training once, and I'm asking people, I'm like, okay, what industries are you in? And one of them owned a gold mine. I'm like, okay, I've never consulted a gold mine before. So here we go. Let's talk about how to manage a gold mine. So yeah, you definitely do get a large variety of businesses. But okay. So you've got this huge variety of businesses, and on this show we have a huge variety of businesses. We've got people all the way from startups to very successful small to medium businesses. If someone were new to the theory of constraints, where would you start them? What would you say to a business that maybe, the goal is a pretty well 4-hour work week type book that is just so cliche that everyone's at least heard of it. So a lot of these businesses have never heard of this. They don't even know what you're talking about. Where would you start with an eclectic reach of businesses?
So I would start by explaining the basics of a theory of constraints, and that is a chain of dependent events. So you think of a chain, and there are links, right? There are links like this, link, 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 link. So you start at the beginning, and the end of the chain is there. So each link is a process or something that gets done. And in the very basics, each one of those links is going to do something and then pass it to the next link, right?
Right.
So, so the time, looking at the time for each link to complete its process is going to give you your basic system. And so let's say I'm making chocolates.
Okay.
Utah truffles are my favorite, but not everybody has access to them, and I feel sorry for them. But so let's say that you're going to make the centers for the truffle, and then you're going to melt the chocolate, and you're going to do that at the same time. So the centers take 25 minutes to make, and melting the chocolate takes 40 minutes, right? And then they come together, and they get put together. So the chocolate goes over the center, and then it goes into a cooling place. And let's say the chocolate's going over the center is like 15 minutes, like super fast and awesome. They got a great piece of machinery, maybe. And they go into a cooling rack, and the cooling rack is 65 minutes because you've got to control the cooling, let's say. And then they pop out of the cooling in 100-piece batches, and they go and get wrapped and boxed, and wrapped is 15 minutes and boxed is like 30-ish minutes.
Sure.
Now, if somebody asks me, how many pieces of chocolate can I get through this chain in a day or an hour or some time frame? I'm going to go, oh, well, there's 20 minutes here, but there's like 65 minutes here, and there's 20, 30, and it starts to get really complicated. But because, and I really don't like this, but this is how it's said, you look for the weakest link in that chain. And weakest, we're talking about longest process time.
Okay.
So my cooling is clearly my longest process time. So looking at it from theory of constraints, I look at the links in the chain and I go, oh, well, you can get 100 pieces out of this whole system every 65 minutes. And that's it. That's all the more you can do. You can ramp up everything times, outside of the cooling, but everything gets stopped, gets bottlenecked at the cooling stage. And so that's all your system can produce. And then a lot of folks will take this understanding and they'll go, well, great. Let's play Battleship, right? I know where the constraint is. Let's blow it up. Let's get another cooling rack, and which is fine, but it really just moved the constraint to another place. And so a lot of people in the early days would just go around blowing up their constraints, but they're just shifting their system over and over and over again and spending money in the process. So there are actually 5 focusing steps that that people use for the theory of constraints when you're doing it, and these are the 5 focusing steps.
Okay. So
step 1 is identify the constraint. Well, we just did that. It's the cooling tray.
Perfect.
So step 2 is exploit the constraint, and exploit is a strong word,
right?
I think, right? It's like, well, what we're trying to say is we're trying to maximize the constraint as much as it can do, right? So if so let's say the cooling rack, they shut it down for lunchtime because somebody's got to watch it. Let's pretend. Sure. And so you lose a whole hour of lunchtime in your entire process because that cooling rack, that cooling tray is off. It's not working. And so one way to exploit it is to make sure that it never gets lunch, right? That lunchtime, it never shuts down. Never shuts down. Another way to exploit it would be to make sure that any preventative maintenance, right, happens when everything else is shut down. So maybe on a holiday. Another way to exploit it would be to have it run overnight because it's the scarce resource, if you will. So you exploit the constraint. That's number two. And then number three is another step that a lot of people don't understand, and it's very powerful. It's subordinate and synchronize the rest of the system based on that constrained resource. So
okay, yeah, you got to explain this a little bit.
Yeah, where you're going to subordinate and synchronize. So this is where you implement drum buffer rope, which I'll explain in a minute.
Okay.
But essentially, the constraint is where you want to have your stash of inventory, right? You want to have the entire system supporting the work of that constraint. And so that it never goes down and it works optimally and everybody's focused on that. And that is the beauty of the theory of constraints. You take this complicated system, but everybody knows what the focus is. Everybody knows we have to keep the constraint running. And it makes conflict less, and it makes decision power pushed down almost to the worker level, a lot of times to the worker level. And so it's great. So you subordinate and synchronize. That's step three. Okay. And then step four is you elevate the constraint, which means you get another cooling tray. Uh-huh. Right? You raise the capacity of that constrained resource. And step five is, okay, now we've got to go identify, did our constraint move? And if it did, we've got to exploit that constraint. We've got to subordinate to that constraint. And then we've got to have the rest of the system. We rework our system a little bit and our focus and our measurements around the new constraint. So those are the five focusing steps that really, once you identify your constraint, anybody in any industry can do those.
So it kind of sounded to me as you were talking and you said initially everyone was just kind of like blowing up their constraint. It sounded like they were going from step one to step four and kind of skipping that step 2 and 3. That as you're outlining and you're saying, okay, look, you can just blow it up, but if you're not taking step 2 and 3, you're not maximizing your efficiencies here. You're just kind of bouncing around, skipping ahead, might get a little bit of gain from it, but not really maximizing the gain. Is that a fair assessment of kind of the, I guess, overly simplified way of saying, look, here is an approach, but here's a more effective approach to take in your business?
Yeah, that's a really good summary of what it is. And a lot of people, they're throwing a lot of money when they're elevating constraint after constraint after constraint. So yeah, it's less effective. You want to work with what you have and get the most out of it first.
So in my experience in working with businesses, and I'd love to hear from you because you really dig into this, but in my experience, I feel like there's a lot of businesses that misidentify the constraint. You gave a simplified example so that, the people listening to this podcast can easily catch on and be like, oh, the cooling rack, that's clearly the constraint. But, if you were go into like that doctor's office situation, and all of a sudden, the constraint might be the doctor who is going from patient to patient, and that doctor doesn't realize that they're the ones slowing the process down, and so they're constantly trying to optimize the front office staff, and they're trying to optimize, use software and technology to, manage their appointments and things like that. Have you seen that? Because that seems like it would be one of those things where you kind of got to leave the ego at the door and maybe admit that, hey, you might be the problem. The CEO might be causing all of this backlog to where others can't get their job done efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Usually with the example you brought up, oftentimes a doctor's office or a medical office, the constraint is actually the billing person.
Okay.
How fast they can get the billing out to get the money coming back in. So yeah, the constraint can be hidden. It can be not obvious.
So this is interesting because, I just gave a hypothetical example and immediately you went to, well, here's the typical place that you would want to look. I assume there are some patterns that, pop up in industries. And if I was in a certain industry, I could probably start by looking at the obvious patterns and start there. I mean, is that something that you would advise someone who's kind of just first getting into this to do, or would it be smarter for them to dig in and do, more of a individual analysis of their company?
Well, I don't think that it's very common to know what the constraints of the industry are. Sometimes, I
Okay.
mean, sometimes it's clearer than others, but I would say if it was me recommending to somebody, do a high level map of, when how you're developing the actual product. Like, what is customer comes in, customer pays you. Like, what is that process? They come into the office, they fill out paperwork, or they make an appointment and they fill out paperwork, then they show up, then they have, something happens, and then, and finally insurance gets billed. So you follow the money, really.
Okay.
Throughput is really, what's the definition? It's sales minus the total variable costs, right? So it's everything that's calculated in that particular variable. But when you're looking at the overall process, that's going to clarify what you're actually, because we're not doing gap accounting. I mean, it's kind of an it's in there. It's what is it? Accounting across a constrained resource. That's the type of accounting we're doing, and it allows you to see, where really am I making money? What really is my process? And for people who understand and who've experienced and they've been in the industry or in their company, it'll take maybe an hour to map the processes and see, because of dependent events. Now, that being said, there are 4 structures for people to be aware of. There's an I plant, which I just pretty much described in the chocolate example. But there's a V plant where you have a few small resources that burst out into lots of different things. Steel is your classic example. You've got molten steel, and in the end, you're going to have I-beams and sheet and short I-beams and long, long poles and all those sorts of things.
Okay.
So that's your classic V. And then the constraint's going to be a different thing. There's also an A plant, like when you're building an airplane or a rocket, right? All of the assembly has to come up into the one product. And so the constraint's going to look a bit different there. And then there's a T plant. So let me backtrack a little bit. So if you understand what plant structure you are, it's going to help you figure out what your constraint is. If it's an I plant, it's straightforward. If it's a V or an A, understanding those structures is going to help you be smarter about picking the constraint, because it can be confusing.
So on these different types of plants, if it is a service type business or industry, do they also have the 4 different that they fall into as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for example, distribution, let's say we're looking over the distribution chain for a lot of different things. A lot of times a distribution chain, multiple companies can be in that V configuration. And if you've got a lot in a service industry, if you've got a lot of things coming together, then probably you're going to be closer to an A. Project management is closer to an A. It's got some hybridization, but the constraints in project management, for example, so you've got 3 parameters. You've got scope, like what you're going to actually do, which includes quality in my mind. Okay. The budget, the money that you're working with, and the time in which you have to do it. So those are the 3 things you're balancing, and you're trying to meet all those together. What's going to determine whether you can meet those is usually a constrained resource. And you've got to look and see, who's my constrained resource. If I'm building a house, is it like, who is in there? Like, can be drywall, it can be plumbing, it can be electrical, it can be the general contractor, it can be the site supervisor, right? Who's the constrained resource that until they show up, nothing happens, And then you manage that resource over the project. So you give them a heads up, you make sure they're always there, you're exploiting, you're subordinating that particular project. So that's why the manufacturing floor example is so great, because it's so clear. And then you start to get in some of these other complex systems. And it's like, how does that work?
Well, and I want to throw a complexity at you, something that I grapple with, and that is innovation. So I'm going to give kind of a funny story, and then have you hopefully answer some questions about innovation. So when my wife and I first got engaged, I went and picked out the engagement ring for her. And I went to this jeweler that they were going to set the diamonds into the ring. And I remember that he said something that was really quite funny. Is we kind of picked out what we wanted, and we were going to have them set. And he said, "Well, we've got this guy that he sets the diamonds, and he does amazing work." It's like, but we can't push him because he's a true artist. And he kind of does it when he feels like doing it, but he's so good that we just sort of put up with that. So I'll let you know when it's ready, but I can't give you a deadline because he's an artist. And I kind of laughed about that because it was, it was funny and anecdotal at the time. But as I have gone throughout my business career, I've noticed that innovation, anyone who's doing like R&D, or they're really trying to be disruptive in a new space or a new environment, and it requires a high level of creativity. The challenge is when you start to structure creativity, you kill creativity, because creativity has to kind of allow itself to free form to a degree. But then the flip side of that is if you allow people to just get overly creative, everyone wants to follow the Google model where there's like, oh yeah, it's cool, we play ping pong. And I'm like, Google's got a lot of things dialed, like they're very dialed in. They're not as free form as it might seem. And so in the theory of constraints, how would you manage a very creative, innovative process without killing the creativity, but also improving the efficiency?
Really good question. I think a bottleneck allows people to be creative.
Okay.
If you create constraints, actually drive creativity. Necessity is the mother of invention.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of that. So if you have the goal or the objective that you're trying to accomplish, this is like, well, this is what we're trying to do, and maybe it's a little further out than just we're trying to change a tire. Yeah. And then you allow people to experiment on how they're going to reach that objective within the parameters of what they have. So here are the tools you have. Here's the budget you have. Here are the materials you have. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Knock yourself out, right? It's really a prototyping scenario when you're doing that. But the constraints are not always a negative, because they narrow down the creative process. Because like you're saying, the creative process can be huge as far as innovation. You can innovate here and here and here. But if you're like, oh, we want to innovate here because this is what we need, can you innovate around this? Then suddenly all those creative juices are focused on a specific thing that they're trying to accomplish. And that's when resources will show up. And it's like, what if we had an arc welder and we did this and this and this, but then it's focused. And so I think it's a balance of focus and constraint or limitation, and the ability to experiment and do new things. And a lot of innovation is, especially information age information. One of the reasons we're showing so much knowledge just exploding is because people are being able to reference multiple information sources, not just the source, but for example, like a pop-up tent. Those tents that like pop up, and they were huge. The spring bar tents, they were huge. Well, there was somebody who who was like hauling around a baby playpen, and they're like, oh, this thing's huge and I have to set it up and it's horrible. And so they're like, hey, but my pop-up tent, I just like swing that thing up in 5 minutes or less. It's great. And I haul it around in a little bag. And they're like, let me apply this technology and this, what they're doing over here, on this problem. And so we got some really strong innovation in the late 90s, early 90s for playpens, mobile playpens, where they're easy to set up, easy to take down, easy to haul, easy to store. I think strollers have gone through a similar type of innovative cycle. And so a lot of innovation, you don't have to just pull it out of the air. You know what I mean? So having the constrained focused what you need to accomplish, and then allowing experimentation and creativity and exploration into how are other people in other spaces solving this problem, usually facilitates innovation.
So I actually love how you're talking about taking something that's perceived as negative. The constraint is perceived as negative. It's perceived as the problem. And instead of trying to eliminate it, you're trying to, I'm going to use the word exploit it, because you've already used some strong language here. But we're taking that constraint and we're making it a tool in our arsenal. And so, instead of the boulder being in the way, the boulder now is the anchor that I can anchor my bridge to, that, makes my road continue, kind of using a weird little metaphor here. So no, I think that's a beautiful way to look at it, and a very different, unique way to look at it. So final question that I have here before we wrap up this interview, and that is, what is the process like? I feel like a lot of businesses probably get started down this road, and I imagine that it's great until it's not. You start doing the theory of constraints, you start understanding some constraints that you have, and you see all the opportunity that can open up. But as is typical, businesses get distracted. They come up against brick walls. There's like, I don't know how to get past this constraint. Maybe they get a little bit confused. They're like, you had me at steps 1 and 2, but then when you started throwing everything in, I got lost. What have you seen? How would you advise businesses? I mean, I'm assuming, based on your passion here, that it never stops. I mean, that's what step 5 is this idea of, okay, now we're going to reevaluate and start the process again. Mm-hmm. So how would you advise a business owner to see it through, and at what point do they know that they've actually done it correctly? How can they get a nice feedback loop that says, okay, we went through this process and here's what we gained from it? So what's kind of the follow through that you would recommend for small, medium businesses looking at this path?
Well, measurements become actually helpful, because once you measure your current output or throughput, then you put in constraint management, and you can watch that throughput. And you should, on average, you can get a 20% increase in throughput on average. And you'll see, oh, this is working. The other way to focus the whole and stop the distraction is that you have that constraint schedule, the schedule of the constraint, where it's the buffers in place, the schedule it's moving through, it's pulling material into the system as the constraint can process it, right? You have that visible to everybody. And so that becomes the pivot point that focuses the system. And it's very simple, once you set it up, but everybody focuses on that. And then they make decisions based on that. And is it going to increase our throughput? Is it a necessary condition that we have to have? Because those are a thing. But that system that's creating money for your company, that's what the focus is. And you don't get distracted by gap accounting, and you don't get distracted by maybe a new cool piece of equipment, And then I should tell you this part too before we leave. But that's the beauty of the theory of constraints. And if you can put the measurement in place and have the schedule visible so everybody can see the buffer schedule, they can see the constraint schedule and the pulling it into the system, it grounds it. Mm-hmm. And then distractions can happen. You can work on other things, but the heartbeat of that business keeps going and it's effective and people make good decisions. There is something that I would tell small and medium businesses especially, okay, is that if you take it up a level, there are 3 places you're going to have a constraint. One is you're going to have an internal constraint. It's going to be inside your business. Okay. And in large part, those are the best kind because you can control them, right? But you can also have a vendor constraint, meaning that they're not, hello COVID, right? They're not giving you the materials that you need. And so that is the thing, that outside supplier becomes your constraint. And so you maximize the outside supplier, right? You apply the 5 steps to that. And then the other constraint that businesses can have is it can be a market constraint. And that's if I could supply twice as much as we do right now, but nobody's buying. So then instead of keep focusing on, well, maybe we can supply 2.5 times more. Well, nobody's buying. So you don't want to focus there. You want to focus on the market and increasing your sales. So maybe that's part of it is you pull up a level and perspective wise and say, okay, is our real constraint internal, supplier, or market? And then you focus on that. So I don't know. It's a really good question that you asked.
Well, I feel like it was a really good response. I feel like we got tons of insight here. So if people want to take this further, how could they, I don't know if they can connect with you or maybe your center, or are there any resources that you would recommend, books or other resources that might be valuable for entrepreneurs that, they're really into this and they want to take it further?
Well, the goal is a great place to start. It is a story. It's not a text. It's not a handbook. So that is a great place to start. I am happy to meet with somebody and just help them map out or clear up their investigation. If it's more complicated, the thinking processes, which is also a theory of constraints, where you really figure out how to problem solve and explore. The thinking processes are interesting. I'm trying to think of the best handbook. Detmer has written some really interesting books that are more handbooks, but some of them are really deep. So there are consultants like throughout the world that do theory of constraints. But yeah, I'd read the goal and see if you can map your process. See if you're a V plant, an A plant, an I plant, and then feel free to contact me or I'm at the Small Business Development Center there, and I can probably give you some more specific or give them some more specific information. But it's really cool way to control your system and feel like you're in control of your system a little more than, managing it from that constrained point instead of trying to manage everything. But I mean, business is complicated.
And I mean, that's what keeps it exciting. So
it's true.
If someone did want to reach out to you, what's the best way to connect there with the Orem Center? Is there an email or a website? What would you have to do?
So our website is UVU, Utah Valley University, UVU at uvu.edu/SBDC, like snake, boy, dog, cat.
Or Small Business Development Center.
Well, you could say that too, but the other one's easier to remember. So, and then just register for an appointment or call for an appointment. And then this is what I do, right? This is what I love. I help small business owners, and it's free and it's confidential and all the things. So, and then I could help people just kind of see what their frustration is, what their roadblock is, and guide them to something more specific. So yeah, just make an appointment, phone call, Zoom call, in person. We do it all.
Wonderful. Well, thanks you so much, Camille. This has been very enlightening for me. I mean, I've read the goal. I've taken a theory of constraints course in my MBA program. And I actually learned a lot just in talking to you. I'm like, oh, wow, yeah, there's a lot more I could be doing with theory of constraints. So very, very enlightening, great interview. I appreciate that. And you have been listening to Learn Biz. This is the podcast where we talk about the growth of your small business. If you like what we have here, go ahead and check out our other, we've got a YouTube channel for Learn Biz. You can catch that at Ryan Earl Murray is the handle there, or you can go to our all of our learning content is going to be found on jazzjune.com/learnbiz. Or you can just go to our website, learnbiz.co, and that'll connect you to all those resources. Thanks so much, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks, Ryan.